The year was 1943. Across the skies of Europe, American pilots were already writing history in the sleek lines of the P-51 Mustang and the rugged strength of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Yet, behind closed doors in a quiet corner of the Bell Aircraft Corporation in Buffalo, New York, engineers were creating something different, something that, at least on paper, could outclimb, outturn, and even outshoot them all. Its name was the P-63 Kingcobra, a name that promised power, danger, and royal supremacy in the air. For a brief moment, it looked as if America had built the perfect fighter, fast, heavily armed, and elegant. But the Kingcobra's destiny would take a strange and unexpected turn. Despite its American birth, it would never wear US colors in combat. Instead, its glory would belong to another nation entirely. Bell Aircraft was no stranger to bold designs. Their earlier model, the P-39 era Cobra, had been one of the first fighters to place the engine behind the pilot, a radical idea in the early 1940s. The new project, the XP-63, was meant to fix every shortcoming of its predecessor. Bell's engineers redesigned the wings, refined the aerodynamics, and strengthened the fuselage. They fitted the aircraft with a 1,325 horsepower Allison V1710-93 engine, giving it a top speed of nearly 410 miles per hour, 660 km/h, impressive for its time. Armed with a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and a pair of .50 caliber machine guns, the Kingcobra packed a devastating punch. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could shred enemy bombers or tear through armored vehicles with ease. Test pilots at Wright Field described it as a thoroughbred, smooth and stable at low altitudes. Everything about it looked ready for the skies over Europe or the Pacific, and yet it would never see them. When the first prototypes rolled out for testing, US Army Air Forces officials were cautiously optimistic. The P-63 handled beautifully in low to mid-altitude flight, and its firepower was unmatched. But when engineers pushed it higher, beyond 25,000 feet, where dogfights often raged, performance began to fade. The supercharger simply couldn't keep up. Compared to the Mustang's Rolls-Royce-derived Packard Merlin engine, the Allison V1710 was less efficient at high altitudes. The verdict came swiftly. The P-63 was excellent in low-altitude operations, but inferior to existing fighters in high-altitude performance. In the bureaucratic language of wartime procurement, that single sentence was a death sentence. By late 1943, the US had already committed massive production to the P-51, P-47, and P-38 Lightning. Factories were running at full capacity, and supply chains were locked in. There was no room and no budget for another frontline fighter that didn't clearly outperform the ones already in service. So the Kingcobra, despite its promise, was quietly sidelined. The irony was bitter. Bell's engineers had built a machine that many test pilots genuinely admired. In some reports, they even claimed that the Kingcobra was easier to fly and more responsive than the Mustang. But the strategic doctrine of the US Army Air Forces was focused on high-altitude escort and long-range missions, not low-altitude tactical strikes. And that was where the Kingcobra excelled, at ground attack, precision strafing, and low-level dogfights. It had been designed for the wrong kind of war. Still, production continued. Bell Aircraft completed over 3,000 units between 1943 and 1945, more than many aircraft that did see combat. But what do you do with thousands of advanced fighters that your own Air Force doesn't want to fly? The answer came from across the ocean. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States had been supplying weapons and aircraft to its allies, including the Soviet Union. The Soviets had already flown the P-39 era Cobra with surprising success, especially in low-altitude engagements on the Eastern Front. When they learned about the Kingcobra, faster, stronger, and better armored, They immediately requested it. The US agreed, and so the Kingcobra, born in America, ignored by America, began its journey across the Bering Strait into the hands of Soviet pilots who would make it legendary. But before that chapter began, a different, almost absurd fate awaited part of the American fleet. Many Kingcobras that remained in the US were converted into RP-63 pinball targets, heavily armored aircraft used to train gunners. Painted in bright orange and fitted with sensors that registered hits from frangible bullets, these once promising fighters became flying targets. Pilots risked their lives inside them while rookie gunners practiced their aim. What had been designed to dominate the sky was now literally being shot at for training. As one aviation historian later wrote, the P-63 was the best American fighter that never fought, except as a target. For Bell Aircraft's engineers, it was a cruel twist of fate. For historians, it remains one of the most intriguing what-ifs of the Second World War. And for the pilots who flew it, the Kingcobra was a reminder that war is not just about performance or design. It's about politics, timing, and decisions made far from the battlefield. As World War II neared its end, the Kingcobra's story was only beginning. Not in American skies, but in the hands of a new ally that would take this forgotten machine and turn it into a weapon of legend. If the P-39-era Cobra had been a bold experiment, the P-63 Kingcobra was Bell Aircraft's declaration of mastery. The engineers who once shocked the aviation world by placing an engine behind the pilot were now determined to prove they could build a fighter as elegant as it was lethal. The project began in 1941 under the internal name Model 24. The US Army Air Forces had asked for a refined era Cobra, one that could climb faster, handle better, and deliver more firepower. Bell's chief engineer, Robert Woods, and test pilot Robert Stanley knew they needed to reinvent the entire airframe rather than simply upgrade the old design. Thus was born the XP-63 prototype, nicknamed in the hangars as the Kingcobra, a serpent worthy of the crown. Engineering a predator. Every inch of the Kingcobra's frame told a story of ambition. Its laminar flow wing, inspired by research from NACA, NASA's predecessor, reduced drag and allowed smoother airflow at high speed. The wingspan was shortened to 7 meters, 37 feet, making the aircraft more agile and responsive. The engine, an Allison V1710-93 V12, was mounted behind the pilot, connected to the propeller via a long shaft that ran beneath the cockpit. It was a risky choice that gave the aircraft its distinctive balance and visibility advantages over conventional fighters. This unusual arrangement offered a clean nose for a 37mm M4 cannon that fired through the propeller hub. Few fighters in World War II could boast such a weapon. 2 additional 50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the nose and sometimes 2 more in the wings. In a single burst, the Kingcobra could rip through bombers, armored vehicles, or low-flying columns with terrifying efficiency. At low altitudes, below 15,000 feet, its firepower and stability were outstanding. Bell's prototype flew for the first time on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. Robert Stanley lifted the aircraft into the sky above Niagara Falls and returned with a simple report: "It flies like a dream." The Army Air Forces ordered 2 more prototypes immediately. The era of the Kingcobra had begun. A technical marvel in testing, the Kingcobra reached a top speed of 410 miles per hour, 660 km/h at altitude, faster than the P-39 and competitive with the Mustang. It could climb to 20,000 feet in just under 7 minutes and boasted a range of up to 100 kilometers, 680 miles. But it wasn't just about numbers. The aircraft handled beautifully. Its tricycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings smoother than most fighters of the era. The pilot sat in a wide bubble canopy with excellent visibility, something that combat veterans would later praise as a lifesaver. Bell also introduced a number of small but important improvements. The radiator was relocated to the wing roots, reducing drag and improving cooling efficiency. The tail assembly was redesigned for stability at high speeds. Each iteration of the P-63 incorporated feedback from test pilots at Wright Field, creating one of the most refined airframes of the war. The third prototype, P-63A, became the template for mass production. By early 1943, Bell was ready to move into full manufacturing. Workers in Buffalo and later at a new plant in Niagara Falls worked around the clock, turning out a machine that seemed destined for the front lines. To the public, it was another symbol of American ingenuity, a sleek, all-metal fighter that looked like it belonged in the future. Promises and problems. But the Kingcobra's birth was not without pain. During early tests, engineers discovered that its performance dropped sharply above 25,000 feet. The Allison engine lacked a two-stage supercharger, and Bell had no license to use the Merlin engines that powered the P-51. For European theaters, where air combat took place at 30,000 feet or higher, this was a major handicap. Still, at low and medium altitudes, the Kingcobra was a beast. Its acceleration was lightning fast, its turn radius tight, and its roll rate among the best of any American fighter. Test pilot Tony Levier, who later became famous with Lockheed, flew the Kingcobra and remarked that it was beautifully balanced and deadly accurate. He noted that it handled like an extension of your own hands, praise that few wartime fighters earned. In ground attack simulations, its 37mm cannon could destroy tanks and fortifications with 1 or 2 hits, something no other single-engine fighter in the US arsenal could claim. As the prototypes evolved into the P-63A and later the P-63C models, Bell added improvements such as thicker armor, larger ailerons, and a more efficient 4-bladed propeller. The C variant introduced the Allison V1710-117 engine, boosting power to 1,500 horsepower and raising the top speed to nearly 430 mpn, 692 km/h. On paper, it was a fighter that could stand shoulder to shoulder with any in the world, designed for a different war. The irony, of course, was that the Kingcobra was optimized for the kind of combat the US was no longer fighting. By the time it was ready, the Allied strategy had shifted toward long-range escorts for bombing missions deep into Germany, missions at high altitude where the Merlin-powered P-51 reigned supreme. The Kingcobra was an aircraft in search of a battlefield that no longer existed. To the engineers in Buffalo, this felt like an injustice. They had created a technically brilliant fighter that excelled at close air support and low-level engagements, but doctrines and priorities had moved on. As one internal Bell memorandum put it, the Kingcobra is not a failure of engineering, but a victim of timing. Still, Bell continued refining the design. By 1944, production lines were fully active, and the company was building hundreds of Kingcobras each month. They knew the aircraft was too good to be discarded. If America did not want it, perhaps someone else would. A fighter looking for a home that someone was already watching. Soviet air attaches in Washington had been closely following Bell's work since the days of the P-39. Their pilots admired the rear engine layout, which gave exceptional stability at low levels, perfect for the Eastern Front. When news of the P-63's capabilities reached Moscow, their interest was immediate. They wanted it in bulk. And thus, even as the US Army Air Forces quietly moved on, Bell found a new customer. By late 1943, a large portion of the Kingcobra production run was already earmarked for delivery to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease Act. In the months ahead, those crates marked Bell aircraft Niagara Falls would cross the Pacific by the thousands. The Kingcobra had been born in America, but its future belonged elsewhere. It was an aircraft ahead of its time, too late for one war and too early for the next. Yet in the hands of Soviet pilots, this forgotten machine would soon prove that its bite was deadlier than anyone in Washington had imagined. When the Bell P-63 Kingcobra was ready for combat, the war had already chosen its favorites. The P-51 Mustang was the glamorous hero, the sleek escort fighter that could reach Berlin and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the rugged workhorse, a flying anvil that could dive through flak and return home riddled with holes. In comparison, the P-63 seemed to exist in the shadows, a powerful but unwanted heir to the throne. It wasn't a matter of failure, it was a matter of timing and doctrine. By late 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed everything to high-altitude, long-range bombing campaigns over Europe. Fighters were expected to climb to 30,000 feet, escort bombers for hours, and fight Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in the thin air above the clouds. The Kingcobra was different. It was a low to medium altitude brawler, perfect for quick strikes, ground attacks, and tight dogfights near the deck. It could outperform almost anything below 15,000 feet, but above that, the Allison engine began to gasp for air. That limitation, though technical, was fatal. The rejection. At Wright Field, the U.S. testing center, pilots praised its balance, maneuverability, and lethal firepower. Yet official reports were brutally pragmatic. One 1944 evaluation read, "Performance at altitude inferior to P-51 and P-47. Operational redundancy makes large-scale deployment unnecessary." In other words, America already had enough fighters and no strategic reason to use another. The Army Air Forces concluded that while the Kingcobra was excellent in its niche, it simply didn't fit the war they were fighting. The European theater was about high-altitude escorts. The Pacific was shifting toward carrier-based aircraft. The P-63 didn't belong in either place, so despite Bell aircraft producing over 3,300 units, the Kingcobra never received a U.S. combat assignment. The order came down quietly: redirect production to training, testing, and foreign aid. In Buffalo, the reaction was disbelief. Engineers who had poured years into the design saw their creation dismissed without ceremony. As one Bell employee later recalled, "It was like watching a racehorse locked in a stable while the race went on without it. But the story of the Kingcobra was not ending. It was changing continents." Across the Bering Strait, the answer came from an unlikely ally: the Soviet Union. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the US had been supplying the Soviets with tanks, trucks, and aircraft to fight the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots had already flown the P-39 Airacobra, Bell's earlier model, with surprising success. Western analysts had once mocked the Airacobra's mid-engine design, but on the Eastern Front, where most combat occurred below 15,000 feet, it was almost perfect. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin, who scored dozens of kills in a P-39, famously said, "The Airacobra suits our tactics. It fights where the war is fought close to the ground." So when news reached Moscow that Bell had built an improved version, faster and stronger, the Soviets didn't hesitate. They wanted every Kingcobra they could get. The US approved the transfer. In 1944, long convoys of crates marked P-63 Kingcobra. Bell Aircraft Corporation, Niagara Falls, NY, began their journey north. From factories in New York, the planes were shipped by rail to Alaska, assembled at Great Falls Air Base in Montana, and flown across the Bering Strait to Soviet airfields in Siberia. The route was dangerous: freezing weather, limited navigation, and long distances. But by the end of the war, over 2,400 P-63s had made the crossing. A second life. Under the Red Star. For the Soviets, the Kingcobra was a revelation. Its low-altitude power and heavy armament fit perfectly into their tactical doctrine. Soviet air battles were fast, brutal, and close to the ground, exactly where the Kingcobra excelled. They modified some units for ground attack roles, strafing German tanks and troop columns. The massive 37mm cannon, once deemed excessive by American standards, became one of their most valued weapons. Pilots praised its stability, armor, and precision. According to records later declassified by the Russian Air Force, the P-63 showed a kill-to-loss ratio nearly equal to the P-39, and its reliability in cold climates was excellent. In interviews decades later, Soviet veterans described the Kingcobra as solid, forgiving, and lethal. When Japan declared war on the Soviet Union in August 1945, Kingcobras flew in the final operations of World War II, airstrikes over Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. Though their role was brief, it gave the aircraft something it never had under American command: combat history. Meanwhile, in the US, back in America, the Kingcobra found a stranger fate. Many units that weren't shipped overseas were converted into RP-63 pinball target aircraft. These bright orange machines were fitted with armor plating and sensors to register hits from frangible bullets used in gunnery training. Pilots inside flew real missions, dodging live fire, while training gunners learned to hit a moving target. It was dangerous work. Some pilots joked bitterly that they were the most shot-at men in the Army Air Forces. In a cruel twist, the fighter once designed to dominate the skies became a literal target, a symbol of how war can twist innovation into irony. Redemption. For Bell's engineers and the pilots who loved it, knowing the Kingcobra found purpose under another flag brought a measure of pride. The Soviets gave it the war it deserved. Under their hands, the aircraft that America ignored became a trusted warrior. It never earned headlines or Hollywood glory, but it earned something far rarer: respect from those who flew it in real combat. Historians today often describe the P-63 as the best American fighter that never fought for America. In a sense, that may be true. It fought fiercely, just not under the stars and stripes. As the war ended and the world shifted into the Cold War, the Kingcobra quietly faded from service. But in Soviet airfields, long after victory parades had ended, a few of them still roared to life, engines echoing across the tundra, proof that even forgotten machines can find redemption. When the P-63 Kingcobra reached Soviet airfields in 1944, it arrived not as a curiosity, but as a promise. Crated in sections and shipped across the freezing expanse of the Bering Strait, these aircraft represented more than American industrial power. They symbolized a rare moment of trust between uneasy allies. In the bitter cold of Siberia, Soviet crews unpacked the sleek, unfamiliar fighters and began assembling what would soon become one of their most respected tools of war. The Red Air Force already knew the Bell name. They had flown thousands of P-39 Airacobras, achieving extraordinary results. Some of the most decorated Soviet aces, including Alexander Pokrishkin, Grigory Rechkalov, and Nikolai Gulayev, had scored dozens of victories in the Airacobra. To them, Bell aircraft was synonymous with reliability and lethality. The Kingcobra, they were told, was its perfected successor, and they were right. Arrival and adaptation. The Soviets received the Kingcobra through the Alaska-Siberia route, known as the ALSIB corridor, one of the most dangerous and vital aerial delivery paths of World War II. American pilots ferried the aircraft from Great Falls, Montana to Fairbanks, Alaska, where Soviet crews took over. They then flew them across thousands of kilometers of snow and ice to bases near Krasnoyarsk and Irkutsk. It was a logistical miracle. By late 1944, entire regiments were equipped with the P-63A and C variants. The aircraft arrived just as the Red Army was preparing for its final offensives in Eastern Europe and Asia. Although the Kingcobra never fought on the European front against Germany, per an agreement between Washington and Moscow, it was held in reserve for operations against Japan. But Soviet engineers were never content to fly foreign machines as delivered. Mahadan, they immediately began modifying the Kingcobra for their own needs. They adjusted the fuel mixture to cope with low-octane Soviet gasoline, installed stronger heaters for cockpit survival in sub-zero conditions, and even altered radio systems to match their frequencies. In some regiments, mechanics painted patriotic slogans on the fuselage, Za Stalina for Stalin, or Za Pobedu for victory. Soon, the Kingcobra became a favorite among frontline pilots. Performance in Soviet hands. At low altitudes, where most Eastern Front battles were fought, the Kingcobra was superb. Soviet test pilot Mark Galai wrote in his post-war memoirs that the P-63 handled like a dancer, graceful, precise, and deadly. Its Allison V-1710 Wonder-17 engine performed remarkably well in the dense, cold air of Siberia, delivering consistent power and reliability. The 37mm cannon, which American commanders had once deemed excessive, became one of its greatest assets. It could destroy trucks, trains, and even tanks with direct hits. According to Soviet records declassified in the 1990s, Kingcobra units achieved high sortie reliability rates, often above 90%, a remarkable figure for wartime aircraft operating in harsh climates. Pilots valued its visibility, stability, and durability. Unlike the lightweight Yakovlev fighters, the P-63 could absorb damage and keep flying. Veterans recalled that German aircraft were rare targets by that stage of the war, but Japanese ones were not. In August 1945, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Kingcobras were unleashed in the skies over Manchuria, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. They escorted bombers, strafed ground convoys, and attacked retreating forces. While official kill counts remain debated, reports indicate that Kingcobras destroyed dozens of enemy positions and aircraft during those campaigns. One pilot, Captain Nikolai Petrov, described it simply: "It was a gift. Fast, stable, strong. We trusted it with our lives." Tactics and training. The Kingcobra changed Soviet pilot training in subtle but lasting ways. Its tricycle landing gear simplified takeoffs for new recruits, and its centralized cockpit gave them better control awareness. Ground crews found it easy to maintain, and replacement parts were abundant thanks to the steady stream of Lend-Lease shipments. Soviet doctrine adapted quickly. Kingcobras were deployed as fighter bombers, providing close air support for advancing tank divisions. They struck enemy strongholds and protected troop movements, often flying at treetop level where radar couldn't track them. Their 37mm cannon and 50 caliber guns tore through ground targets with surgical precision. In post-war interviews, several Soviet officers admitted they preferred the Kingcobra to many homegrown designs. Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, the highest-scoring Allied ace of the war, didn't fly it in combat himself, but publicly acknowledged that it was a robust and powerful machine, one of the finest ever received from America. Recognition and legacy in the USSR. When victory came in 1945, Kingcobras joined the victory parades in Moscow, gleaming under the summer sun with red stars painted proudly on their wings. They continued to serve through the late 1940s in training and border defense roles. In total, the Soviet Union operated approximately 2,400 Kingcobras, making it the aircraft's largest and most successful user by far. For the US, the P-63 was a technical curiosity. For the USSR, it became a symbol of power and partnership, proof that American engineering, when matched with Soviet tactics, could produce extraordinary results. Bell Aircraft, aware of its unexpected fame behind the Iron Curtain, quietly celebrated the reports coming back through diplomatic channels. Engineers were proud that their machine had finally proven itself, even if it was under another flag. a bridge between enemies. Ironically, the Kingcobra ended up serving as one of the few physical bridges between two future rivals. In 1945, as the Cold War began to form, American-built Kingcobras still flew proudly in Soviet skies. They represented a brief moment when cooperation triumphed over ideology, when technology and necessity brought two nations together against a common enemy. Many of those aircraft would later be replaced by Soviet-built designs like the Yak-9U and Lay-11, but their influence lingered. The handling lessons learned from the P-63's aerodynamics and control systems directly influenced early jet prototypes developed in the late 1940s. The Kingcobra's Soviet farewell. By 1948, the last operational P-63s were retired from frontline service. Some were sent to training schools, others scrapped or used as testbeds. A few survived into the early 1950s before disappearing into history. Yet among the pilots who flew them, the Kingcobra's memory never faded. They called it Coral Neighbors, the king of the skies. As one veteran reflected decades later, it was American metal, but it carried a Russian heart. When World War II ended in 1945, the skies that once thundered with propellers began to fall silent. Jet engines were the new sound of progress. The Messerschmitt Me 262 and the Gloucester Meteor had already shown what the future looked like, and it wasn't powered by pistons. For the Bell P-63 Kingcobra, a fighter born at the wrong time, that future meant extinction. The Soviets, who had flown the Kingcobra with pride through the final months of the war, began transitioning to jet aircraft like the MiG-9 and later the MiG-15. In America, the same fate awaited piston-engine fighters. The P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt were celebrated in parades, museums, and movies. The Kingcobra, meanwhile, quietly disappeared. Too late to be a hero, too early to be remembered. After the war. By the late 1940s, Bell Aircraft was already moving on to jet-powered projects like the P-59 Era Comet and the revolutionary X-1 rocket plane that would later break the sound barrier. There was little room in the company's future for a machine that symbolized yesterday's technology. The U.S. Army Air Forces kept only a handful of P-63s for testing and experimental work. Some were stripped of their guns and used for high-speed research. Others were turned into target aircraft, the infamous RP-63 pinballs, fitted with armor and bright orange paint, used to train gunners with frangible bullets. It was a strange, almost tragic afterlife for a fighter once designed to dominate the sky. Most of the 3,300 Kingcobras produced were either shipped overseas or scrapped shortly after the war. Metal was valuable, and demand for new aircraft had plummeted. Rows of Kingcobras sat abandoned on airfields, engines cold, wings stretching toward a sky they would never fly again. Photographs from Davis-Monthan Air Base in Arizona show entire fields of P-63s awaiting the smelter's torch, their aluminum skins reflecting the desert sun one last time. A global farewell. A few nations besides the Soviet Union operated the Kingcobra in the post-war years. France received around 300 units through Lend-Lease and deployed them in Indochina between 1946 and 1949. There, the P-63 flew low-level bombing and strafing missions against insurgent positions in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Despite the heat, humidity, and rugged terrain, pilots found the aircraft surprisingly reliable. Its cannon and machine guns proved devastating in ground support roles, but maintenance difficulties and the rapid arrival of newer designs led to its retirement by 1950. Other small air forces, including those of Honduras and Mexico, briefly operated surplus Kingcobras in the late 1940s. Most were retired before the mid-1950s, replaced by early jets or trainers. And so, the Kingcobra faded not with a crash, but with a whisper, scattered across the world in forgotten hangars and scrapyards. The ghosts that survived for decades. Almost no one spoke of the P-63. Aviation museums preferred the glamorous fighters, the Mustangs, Spitfires and Lightnings. The Kingcobra's story was too complicated, too quiet. Yet a handful of passionate restorers refused to let it vanish. In the 1960s and 1970s, collectors in the United States, Britain and Russia began searching for surviving examples. Some were found in remote airfields in Alaska, others in Siberian warehouses where they had been stored since the war. One of the most famous restorations took place in the 1990s at the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, where a P-63C was painstakingly rebuilt to flying condition using original Bell engineering drawings. Another remarkable survivor, serial number 43111137, now resides at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, fully restored and proudly displayed. When its polished aluminum skin gleams under the museum lights, visitors often stop and ask, "Why have I never heard of this plane?" The answer lies not in its performance, but in politics, timing, and the cruel arithmetic of history. Reassessment. Modern aviation historians have re-evaluated the Kingcobra with a fairer lens. Its climb rate, firepower, and handling at low altitude were excellent. In mock dogfights, surviving P-63s have proven they can outturn many of their contemporaries. The Allison engine, though criticized in wartime, was later found to be robust and efficient when properly maintained. In hindsight, the P-63's failure was not technological. It was contextual. It was designed for a war that had already shifted beyond its strengths. Had it entered combat in 1942 rather than 1944, it might have earned the same fame as the Mustang. Instead, it became a footnote, a legend whispered among engineers and historians rather than sung by pilots in the sky. As aviation writer Dan Hagedorn once summarized, the Kingcobra was the best fighter that never got the chance to prove it. Its only sin was arriving too late. The legacy lives on today. Fewer than 20 P-63s remain worldwide, and only a handful are airworthy. Each one represents a piece of forgotten history, a machine that bridged two superpowers before they became rivals. At air shows across the United States and Europe, the sight of a Kingcobra taking off still draws applause from crowds who sense, even without knowing the full story, that they are witnessing something rare and noble. In a poetic way, the aircraft's name, Kingcobra, fits its destiny. It was feared, misunderstood, and eventually respected. A predator without a kingdom. And yet, as its engines roar again in modern skies, it claims the recognition it was once denied. Standing beneath one of these restored fighters, you can almost imagine the engineers at Bell, the ferry pilots crossing Alaska, and the Soviet aces who trusted it with their lives. Their work, their courage, their machine, all converging in a single metallic shape that still glimmers under the sunlight. The Kingcobra never became a legend of war, but it became something far rarer, a legend of perseverance, proof that greatness can exist even in obscurity.